Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Welcome to the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival 2021 Summer Series. We're really pleased to bring back in-person events, but be mindful that risks remain. We're taking precautions in keeping all events outside, having only ticketed entry, limiting crowd size, avoiding book signings, requiring vaccinations, and cleaning out the tents in between events. So when we're through here, if everybody can head out and we'll clean out the tent. Water's available throughout the day at the tent entrance, at check-in in the info tent. Also, lunch, snacks, and drinks are available for sale at the info tent. Please, when we're done here, we encourage you to buy the authors' books. That's how we support our authors and our programming, and also independent booksellers. All the books are pre-signed because we're not doing book signing, but you'll have a signed book anyway. The authors will take questions at the end of the discussion. If you have questions, if we could just keep them sort of brief so that everybody gets a chance to ask questions. I'm going to just briefly introduce Merissa Nathan Gerson, who will then introduce Danielle Dreilinger, our wonderful author for today. Merissa is a New Orleans-based writer, professor, and sex educator. Her written work has been seen in The Atlantic, The New York Times, Playboy, The Tablet, among others. She was a consultant for Amazon's award-winning television show Transparent. She continues to speak nationwide on sex, Judaism, LGBTQ, inclusion in Jewish spaces, and the inheritance of trauma and memory. Merissa is a member of the Society for Scientific Study of Sex and the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Trainers. She holds an MFA in writing and poetics from Naropa University in Boulder, where she studied Shamantha meditation. Did I say that right?
I think that's good. We're good.
Okay. Anyway, she's incredibly accomplished. I could go on and on, but thank you so much. Please welcome our author and our moderator tonight.
I'm just going to add what's missing is that my book comes out next week, which is called Forget Prayers, Bring Cake, A Single Woman's Guide to Grieving. But most importantly right now is Danielle Dreilinger, who it says currently lives in New Orleans, but is on her way out. She was the education reporter. Can we turn this mic off because I think it's interfering? Covering their... Danielle was an education reporter for the New Orleans Time-Picayune, covering their contentious charter school revolution. Prior to that, she lived in Boston, where she produced WGBH's local news website and wrote for the Boston Globe about gentrification, diversity, and politics. She is the author of The Secret History of Home Economics, How Trailblazing Women Harnessed the Power of Home and Changed the Way We Live. In her rave review for the book, Ann Hood writes, Danielle Dreilinger's The Secret History of Home Economics is a revelation. That secret history is rich with gender and race issues and opened the eyes of this former home ec student. It will open yours too. So I'm so excited to be here with you. This book made me wonder, actually, if I was raised by a career home economist. And
You kind of were.
I kind of was. Excuse me. So there are all these questions we all have. I sort of encourage the audience to quickly just think about, when you think home ec, what do you think? Because I know my mom said sewing and baking cookies, and we're about to blow your mind. Is home ec just wife prep is one of the questions. So I'm going to just give a little bit of a synopsis for those of you that don't know, and then we're going to let Danielle take the floor. So from chore charts to demolding, vitamin C to vegetarianism, Kotex to Kellogg's to green tea, food pyramids, measuring cups, clothing measurements, to military medicine, nutrition science, Aunt Jemima, Betty Crocker, test kitchens in vacant fields, to fake babies, motherhood on real test babies, holy smokes. When I watched this film, The One and Only Dick Gregory, if any of you have seen that incredible documentary, I saw that he was in the wings for the entire civil rights movement, and I had no idea. And the way civil rights was taught was that it was all Martin Luther King who did it, and no one mentioned that there was a comedian emboldening him, and another comedian, and that he was also there emboldening James Baldwin, and that he was there along the way making nutrition changes to the diets of his community and his family. Similarly, this book made me realize that I had no idea that the history of the United States and everything any one of us experiences at home, from our washing machine to the measuring cup we use to the fact that we know what size our clothes are, it's all because of home economists.
Yes.
So I am kind of just in awe of you, and I'm curious if you could just start by just telling us, why did you even care to talk about home ec? And when reading the book, I knew from how much you wrote in like this trot pace that you are in love.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, when did you fall in love with home ec and why bother?
Right. Well, first of all, thank you everybody for coming. This is my first live event for the book, which came out in early May, so it's really thrilling. And, you know.
Woo!
And I can I hire you to write my copy? Because if I could, I'm not good at like the zingy summary paragraph. Any editor of mine can tell you that. So I got interested in home economics through a totally not. I certainly did not like stumble across an amazing discovery. It was a structured brainwave. So this was 2016. I was applying for a journalism fellowship, the Knight Wallace Fellowship, and I knew that this was my opportunity to write a book. And I had applied for the fellowship the year before. I had been a finalist, totally different idea I didn't care about anymore. And in my interview, while I was, you know, sitting there nervously, like literally trying to like hide the fact that my like hangnail had started bleeding in the middle of the interview, one of the board members said, "Oh, the University of Michigan, you like to cook? The University of Michigan has this amazing culinary collection in its library." And I could just see myself light up. And so when I thought about what book I wanted to write, I thought, well, it has to support a book. It has to be long. It has to be something no one's done before. I wanted it to have to do with education because I'd been covering education for several years at that point. I wanted it to concern history because I love reading history. I wanted it to cover race, gender, and class because otherwise, like, why bother? It wouldn't be relevant. I thought, you know, I should use the culinary collection. Like, clearly, I'm excited about that. You know, the rare occasions that the still small voice speaks up for me, I'd listen to it. And after so I just put all those parameters in, and after a few weeks, I was like, oh, home economics, the class that taught girls how to cook in the old days. So that's what I thought it was as well. And even so, I thought, hey, why isn't this back by now? Shouldn't this be back? Because I thought about the last, 20 years. I thought about HGTV and Project Runway and the Food Network and craftivism and women knitting pussy hats and the return of DIY everything and mason jars. And then on top of that, the fears about adulting and the pressures of elevated parenthood. And in the education realm, the pushback against standardized testing. I'm like, oh, isn't this perfectly ripe territory for home economics? Geez, and then the first thing when I actually researched it, the first thing I learned was that one of the founders of home economics was the first woman to go to MIT. And I mean, that immediately just blew my mind. And I start with it in the book, because I wrote the first chapter last, as one does.
Right.
And I just thought, this is where I have to start, because it was the moment that I realized, and this is why the first chapter is called Everything You Think You Know About Home Economics is Wrong.
Yeah.
Like, just at that moment, I was like, clearly there's so much more here than anybody knows. And I mean, I just kept finding out more and more amazing things.
Well, so that's what I'm curious about. Is this book to me is actually a history of the United States of America.
That was the idea.
And that was similar to that. That's why it made me think of that documentary, because it's a history of civil rights through his lens, and this is a history of the U.S. through home economics. And I mean, I'm almost ashamed of what I don't know, and I'm kind of curious. A couple things. One, about your reporting method. So I know you were a reporter, and also a reporter in a crazy city.
Yep.
I'm like a deep devotee of New Orleans. I moved there out of the blue, and I love it. But that city's complicated.
Yep.
And you were reporting on charter schools, which are complicated. So I'm curious
complicated.
how that impacted your methodology, and just to tell us a little bit more, and then we'll get into a little bit of the meat of this book, so people understand what we're talking about, because it's mind-blowing how much these women who were pioneers in many different communities from many backgrounds made your lives.
Right. Also, often single women who brought cake.
Yes, truth. There's a lot of single women in this book, a lot of divorcees in this book,
Yes.
a lot of grieving women in this book.
That's for sure, yeah. So I love talking about method. I'm going to try to keep myself brief. Somebody asked me, in fact, an education reporter asked me, like, what made you think that you could do history? And I basically was like, well, no one told me. It never even occurred to me that I couldn't. I'd always been very interested in history in writing. So back when I was a permalancer at the Boston Globe more than 10 years ago, and I was writing about gentrification, I remember interviewing a woman who had moved there, who had been one of the first rounds of Somerville gentrifiers in 1982, and she was like this, punk girl from New York City. So, and New Orleans education, you can only understand in light of history, both recent and, going all the way back to the beginning. And people in New Orleans are also really into history as well and are tapped in. I have a friend who's one of my closest friends is 7th generation New Orleanian. 7th generation for my family is whatever that patch of Austria was owned by at the time. So I had already looked at, I wrote an article about the anniversary of the first high school for black kids in New Orleans, first public high school rather. Well, the first, they thought they were the first high school for black students. And I went and did some research to see if it was true that they were also the first public high school in Louisiana. P.S. They're not. And so I went to the local history room of the New Orleans Public Library and found the microfilms of the dissertations that had written about all of these things. So I just somehow, and I guess, I love libraries. My first job was working in a library as a page. I made $3.45 an hour. And so I just went and dug around everything. And one of the things that the Knight Wallace gave me was one, it gave me extraordinary library database access. And so much stuff is digitized. So many archives are digitized. So many newspapers are digitized. And it also just gave me the time to just run down whatever rabbit hole I felt like going down. And it was glorious. And I guess the ways that what I bring probably as a more journalistic skills is I knew that I wanted to make this into a story and bring it to life for people. So I have a section about, a person I weave through is an amazing woman named Luzanne Mamer, who worked for the Rural Electrification Administration, which was a New Deal program that electrified the countryside where it wasn't profitable for energy companies to do it. And she created all sorts of innovations to make this happen. We can go into it later. But she was motivated by her own upbringing on the farm. And I wanted to bring this to life. And so I did interview one woman who worked with her, because she didn't die until, died in the early 2000s, and there was an oral history in the Smithsonian done by her coworker. So I just tracked down her coworker, who was 2 weeks from retirement herself, to say, oh, what was she like when she was in her 70s? But then I could have the time to go, she cracked pecans to make money for school. I looked up the Bureau of Labor Statistics inflation calculator, one of my favorite tools, to look at how much money she raised in today's dollars. I always try to do that when I'm writing about the past, is to put it in today's dollars so people have a sense of what it really means. And I looked up, a pamphlet on raising pecans and what that did to your fingers, so I could put in this detail of it turns your fingers brown when you do that. So yeah, that's and I interviewed everybody I could who was alive, but I think I just asked and looked for the kind of details that I knew would make it more real to people.
And I think you make it really real. It's an amazing, you sort of wander through the lives of so many women, and they're all tied together. So we go to, Tuskegee Institute, and we're looking over the history of Mrs. Washington, and we're looking at the histories of New England and other parts of the country and Cornell, and none of us knew that in all of these different places they were blooming something that not only are interacting, but what you write is the home was not a retreat from the world, it was the world. And so there's this idea that each of these women are not just making it so you're good at making chocolate chip cookies, but they're actually innovating a practice to allow women to have power, to have jobs, to have efficiency in the home, and it's also to do upward mobility for all. So she traces every different like community almost in this country and looking at how home economics impacts them. So I think just for this group, could you just describe what is domestic science education? Like, what is it in a nutshell?
Right. So the book, you actually did just a really good job of the main, spelling out the main thesis of the book. So domestic science, first this field was called domestic economy, then it was called domestic science, then it was called home economics. Since the 90s, it's been called family and consumer sciences. That particular name has not caught on. And all through, what the pioneers and founders and innovators wanted was for it to be it was a twofold project. It was to bring science and efficiency and better methods into the home so that, usually women, sometimes men of color, could make a home more quick, like a healthy, happy home more efficiently and spend their time on, move on. Spend their time on what they wanted to do. So it's very much not the 50s image of you have to spend all day cleaning your house. And they thought that you should just get in what actually matters, get out. So when people have asked me it's the pandemic, people are making sourdough, isn't that very home eccy? It's actually kind of not, because they believed in takeout, and they did chemical experiments and taste experiments and method experiments to see which methods of making bread worked better and tasted better, and what were the trade-offs between buying bread at a store and making it yourself. And even if it tastes better if you make it yourself, is that worth your time? They looked at the economic value of a woman's time, and they put in place helped push for laws to make it so the bread commercially was safe and not being whitened by lead, and and for better working conditions for the people who were making it in factories. And at the same time, they were using the home, they were sort of subverting the home to create a range of careers for women where they would be accepted and where they could build a business home of their own, because these were somewhat tenuously at times connected to work women had done at the home. And that could include fashion merchandising, it could include dietetics, it could include writing cookbooks, teaching being an enormous job field for women. And what home economics started out as, and was for many decades, was this jobs engine. So as of about 1970, when Cornell turned the College of Home Economics into the College of Human Ecology, 3/4 of Cornell's women faculty were in the Home Economics College.
And it's also, what I thought was so profound was the amount of education. Like, the book starts with these women saying, no, I'm going to get educated. I'm going to get more educated. I'm going to get even more educated. And then I'm going to go back and figure out how to make home life work. So there's a juxtaposition throughout the book at different times. One of the things you wrote was home economics has been a backdoor for women to enter science.
Yes.
And I would love for you to just talk a little bit about the Kellogg family and eugenics. And there's a lot about, there's these twists at points where it's, oh, this is wonderful. And then it's actually they're using this to breed extreme horrific racism in science. So I'd love to hear about the Kellogg family in general, the diet rules of Mrs. Kellogg, and how they ended up in eugenics.
Right. So what people ask me sometimes, how did I find all of this history, and especially how did I find the bad stuff? And the answer is I looked for it because I knew it was there. So eugenics was widespread in the 1910s. It was widespread in the progressive movement and social work, and I knew it had to be in home economics as well. So backing up slightly, the Kellogg's, as some of you guys might know, John Harvey Kellogg was the Kellogg's were kind of like the Goop of their day. They were like the wellness bros and the Goop of their day. John Harvey Kellogg was a doctor. I guess maybe it's the Dr. Oz of his day is really the best comparison.
Goop is for those that don't know, Goop is like a bougie lifestyle.
It's Gwyneth Paltrow's wellness thing with putting, anyway. So he had a medical health spa in Battle Creek, Michigan, and he believed in, some stuff that's good for you even now, and some stuff that is cray-cray. He believed that you had to poop 5 times a day, that was And he believed in a vegetarian diet and lots of walks and lots of water. He had sexual strictures, which I will not go into. His brother, with whom he fought over many years, there's a great book called The Battling Brothers of Battle Creek that I learned about some of this from originally. His brother took some of their food recipes and became the Kellogg Food Company, cereal company. And they got into home economics, and there's a woman named Lena Frances Cooper who started the nursing course at Battle Creek, didn't like it, got excited about nutrition, and was like the auntie to the Kellogg's children. She was really close to the family. And they sent her to Drexel, where she took their early home economics course, and she co-founded the American Dietetic Association, and she wrote, she did a lot of work in getting dietitians into the military, which then advocating for them to have military status so that soldiers would respect them. And she ran food at Montefiore, which still is the hospital in the Bronx, for many years too. But here's the thing. I knew that the Kellogg's were into eugenics, and I went looking for this because I thought this is probably where it's going to be.
Will you define eugenics for those that don't know?
So eugenics is scientific racism that purports to find a scientific basis for inequality and believes in stamping out, like improving the race, the white race, by selective breeding and forced sterilization of the unfit. And
it's disgusting.
It's gross. I mean, it's horrible. And so the Kellogg's had this magazine called Good Health, and in the 1910s, when Lena Cooper was writing a vegetarian cooking column for it, which was in some ways like quite ahead of its time, like she believed in agave and avocados. They also were writing all of these articles about eugenics, and just this, I decided not to quote any of it in the book. I was like, people know what this stuff is like. I don't need to put it out there further. But really horrible stuff about, exterminating the unfit. And I could not find anything in her writing that said that she believed it. They had, at Battle Creek, they had a conference on eugenics, and Annie and Melville Dewey, who were in the founding group of home economists, they attended, they believed in eugenics. I found some documents in Annie Dewey's, her husband's papers that turned out to be written by her, about eugenics and about, exterminating the unfit. And, as a journalist and a researcher and writer, I was excited to find it and bring it out because, one of the home economics was always a tension between, was it liberation or was it oppression? And if it was liberation, for whom?
Right.
And one of the ways that home economics succeeded was by partnering up with people who thought it was a great way to keep men, who thought it was a great way to keep women barefoot and pregnant, and especially women of color. So while there were always women home economists who were Black, who were Latina, who were working to improve life for their communities, they were excluded from the white mainstream of home economics, and they were also in sort of a triple bind of, was this liberation? So it was not only a gross thing that this particular group of people, some of whom were home economists, did. It reflected the larger problems that were affecting the field and affecting all of us, and to this day.
Well, I think you did a really good job also showing us the thread of American history, because we can't write a history of home economics and say, oh, here's one narrative, because this country was extremely segregated when home economics began.
Right.
So there is the white world of home economics, the Black world of home economics, and then the different worlds that ended up, like Latino and otherwise, that were also able to find access to this field. And I think what you do in this is show us how oh my goodness, at a certain point, these white women just went flying into a disgusting realm, and you really show how racism and power work.
Yeah.
And so there's something interesting. It's like this homegrown thing that ends up in the military.
Yeah.
And I thought that was so fascinating. Could you tell us, there's like segregation, social welfare, et cetera, that these are all parts of the evolution of this craft that became all kinds of things. Could you talk just a little bit about war and home economics? Because I thought that there was a large swath of the book that's basically like war is what popularized home economics because of what they did both for home life and for the soldiers actually at war.
Yeah. So home economists were great at war. They were great at war. They were great at the Depression. They were great at crises. And in fact, when the U.S., the heyday of home economics was World War I through World War II, and when the active crises here dropped away, like that's when home economics turned into what many, we think of it as, like the experience became much more, boring and stupid. So World War I, a bunch of things were happening at the same time. So you had, by this point, the home economists had been working for about 25 years or so on getting the field going, on getting the Margaret Murray Washington at Tuskegee had been in charge of home economics there from about 1890. So she was working on, people were working on curriculum. They were starting to make these college programs where they could train home economists. And at the same time, the federal government was funding and federalized, it was always locally run, but they were creating the extension programs, which many of you guys might know about, which was both agriculture and home economics, and was designed to take scientific discoveries from colleges into the community. So it was a community education program. I mean, funded very, very unequally for African American and white communities, but funded to some extent. And the federal government was creating funding for vocational education for the first time, and was the only vocation it recognized for women was home economics. So there was teacher training money, for instance, that Tuskegee got some of that. And at the same time, you have World War I. And it was Herbert Hoover who got the home economists involved. So he ran the US Food Administration. And basically, the people in charge, the people running the war in the US recognized very quickly that food was a central part of the war. So the slogan was, food will win the war. And they didn't have mandatory rationing, but they had voluntary rationing. And they knew that they needed somebody in charge somebody in charge and a lot of people not in charge, right? To create the rules of if we're gonna eat less wheat, less sugar, how are we gonna do that? If we're gonna eat less meat. And they knew, Herbert Hoover knew about the home economists, so he called Cornell, he telegrammed Cornell, and he said, please will you come, we need you now. And so home ec just sprung into action, and they harnessed all of these, trained women to go out and write recipes and help people. They took over, they had these demonstration railroad cars, and they would just take them down the track and set up in communities, and women could come in and look at fireless cookers. It was a crock pot, basically, that would cook with less energy, and all of these demonstrations and ways to do things better, and pressure canning. And at the same time, they had started having home economics classes in schools, and those classes turned their attention to war sewing. So they would sew patterns from the first aid, for the Red Cross, for soldiers, for refugees. Some of them were very complicated. They would knit socks for soldiers. If any of you guys are knitters and you know the Kitchener stitch on socks, which is every sort of mind-bending way to make seamless toes, that was devised for World War I so that because men's feet were so susceptible to infection, the soldiers, so there'd be less rubbing against their toes.
It's so, all of the different things too, like the efficiency of making measuring cup measurements, or how we fit our clothes, or even the food pyramid, which I had no idea was part of the invention of home economists. It just blows my mind. I'm curious, so in many ways this is a history of control, class, power, gender, like everything in this country. I just wonder if you could speak a little bit more too about men and home economics, because it's not just for women, and also there is sort of this attention to the role of men in the role of women in the way that they presented it, at least as you did it in the book.
Yeah. So men were really not part of home economics until child development came more to the fore in the 1930s and 40s, which then actually put them in, tended to be in a pretty sexist way. But first of all, home economists always wanted to reach boys. They never, the first number of decades of this field, it's gendered because it's women who are doing it. Like, they wanted to empower women. They saw that, the home was no longer a center of production. Like, they have this almost Marxist analysis. And that women are stuck doing, like, Ellen Swallow Richards, the woman who went to MIT, said something like, the boring work never done. And so they wanted to empower women, but they didn't think there was anything there's nothing like attached to the second X chromosome that makes you more of a better mother or a more natural parent or somehow magically able to cook.
And a lot of them weren't mothers.
Most of them were not mothers, right? Because for many decades, being a married woman and having a career, being a mother and having a career was almost impossible. So they always wanted to get boys involved. And Lillian Muller-Gilbreth, the mother in Cheaper by the Dozen, who also worked as a home economist for a time, when she talked about like how can we have careers for women, she would say the men have to get involved in equal child rearing. That's how we did it in my house. And a lot of that, some of the women who were married, had husbands who supported their work. Often, if they were, black women, it was a custom for black women to work, but Frank Gilbreth wanted his wife to be an equal partner in his job, which meant him being an equal partner in the home. But they also they recognized over the years. There's an article I came across that said, where do men learn how to sew and take care of a house and cook? The military. And there's nothing girly about that. So they definitely fought for this for a long time. And in the 70s, Title IX, the law that brought us, women's basketball, also made it illegal to put girls in home ec and boys in shop. The classes had to be open to all genders. And it's been a slow process since then, especially when a gendered course is an elective, more girls take it. But, I have a lot of hope. I went to report from a middle school in Virginia, and I talked to the boys who were in the home economics classes there, and I said, this used to be considered a thing that only girls did. And they just couldn't get over it. They thought it was so dumb. They're like, everybody needs to know how to do this stuff. I'm like, yes, please, just be in power right now, all of you.
Well, it's interesting because I was doing some research for a course recently on initiation rites, and a lot of what this book is talking about, in my opinion, is the initiation rites as the things that used to be sort of niche culture. How do we make them national? And there's a look at national gender training, because I know Zora Neale Hurston writes in Tell My Horse of in Jamaica different kinds of sexual initiations before a wedding, or in Jewish communities. I have one book that's an Orthodox Jewish community doing their Taharat HaMishpacha, which is basically, what does Taharat HaMishpacha mean? Family purity, but it's also about keeping the home, keeping the body, sex practices, etc. So there is an element at a certain point in the book where you do get a little bit more into sex ed, marriage ed, and I didn't, I've watched shows, I'm really into dating shows, so Love Island, on Love Island they have a residue of home ec where they have, all of them have to have babies, fake babies, and on 90210 as a kid.
Wait, there's practice babies on Love Island?
On Love Island.
Oh my God.
Every season.
Thank you for giving me a story hook.
Yes, every single season they have it. And then also on 90210, they had to have flower babies that they had it in their Los Angeles school where they had to go home with this sack of flour and take care of it. And then what was terrifying in your book was when they talked about the real babies that they somehow got. Somehow, for a year, they got real babies that were used on experimentation in home ec projects. I'd love for you to talk about marriage, sex, and babies in home ec for a second.
Right. So I'm going to focus on the practice babies because that's the one that makes everybody's jaw drop. So practice babies. They were babies. They were actual human babies. And I gotta say, when you're reading all of this, like, it kind of makes sense in context. I know. So home economics programs the earliest I found was 1901 at Atlanta University, had home management houses. So that would be an apartment or a house that was like a living lab, and students would live there for like 6 weeks maybe, when they were seniors typically, and this was like a home economics lab class wherein they would work together to have some number of women living there at a time to just run the house, to do the cleaning, planning, to budget, to go shopping around their other classes. And somebody had the bright idea of saying, oh, what's missing from this home is a baby. And there were, many orphanages at the time. And so home economics departments would arrange, usually with a local orphanage, to care for one of their charges for, usually it was 2 semesters. And they would give them a name, like a first name, and the last name would be something connected to the field. So like the one at Eastern Michigan, Eastern Illinois, the baby was David North because he lived in the North practice house. At Cornell, it was Dickie Domicon for domestic economy. And they would have a faculty member living there as well for when the girls went to class.
It's so scary.
And they took care of it. And so these were, the thing is this, I would argue that maybe it's not so scary. Because first of all, what's the comparison? This is a baby in an orphanage, right? With like a small number of staff people for a large number of children. Whereas here, she was living in a cozy, home-like environment, being doted on by tons of women and taken care of and fed properly according to the best practices of the time. They weren't doing experiments like, what happens if we feed them only carrots for a week? It wasn't like that. And they were very popular with adoptive parents. The newspaper said because they've been raised in the most scientific manner, but probably just because they got a ton of attention for that first year. And the kids, the students loved it. But I think what makes this especially fascinating in the larger picture is the way that it is turning what we think of in parenting and like heterosexual, like nuclear families on its head. Because people saw all this, like people could, Greater Society did a great job of looking at what home economists were doing through the lens of, we're just assuming this is making girls into mothers and like stay-at-home mothers, working unpaid mothers. But really, like there was nothing like this, there was no man in this house. There was no husband. This was nothing like taking care of a child of your own. This was the scholar Megan, I think it's the scholar Megan Elias, but it was basically a proto-feminist commune. And there's so much in home economics that was like that. So many of the women being unmarried and not being parents themselves, or not being biological parents and having chosen family. So I think it's really, and when practice babies finally went out of favor, it was in the 50s and 60s, and it was because people were coming and saying, this is unnatural. Babies need to have a relationship with one mother and one father. Mm. And that's an argument we have to this day over like attachment theory. And Margaret Mead at the time said, well, sure, but there are plenty of societies where a flock of women look after the babies and those kids are just fine too.
Amazing. It's so good. So as I was reading the book, I was thinking Oprah, Kris Jenner, all of the Kardashian episodes, Wirecutter, Heidi Merkin.
Wirecutter for sure,
yeah. These are all home economics-esque things, like watching how to, even the Kardashians are kind of cuckoo, but you watch them how they care for their bodies, how they care for their home, how they care for each other. And also Black Panther free lunch programs, like guys like that, free lunch across the country.
I had mentioned the Black Panther free
yes.
lunch programs.
But so my last question, and then we're going to turn over to the audience questions. Your last words in the book are, home economists hate waste. And I wonder if you want to talk just for a second about our current environmental crisis and how home economists are actually really helping with global warming, et cetera.
Oh, great. Yeah, I love this question. So home economics is still around, usually called family and consumer sciences. It's not mandatory in any state in the US, last I checked. And though it is mandatory in Japan and Finland and a lot of other parts of the world. And starting in the 70s, home economists got very concerned with ecology, which was at the root of the field. In fact, Ellen Swallow Richards, one of the names that she bandied about before settling on home economics was ecology. And she was a public health scientist. She was a chemist who worked on water quality and and they, in the 70s, home economists revived this view of like ecological theory. For any of you guys who know about this thing, it's the Bronfenbrenner theory, except they came up with it before Bronfenbrenner, who was a man, and got the credit. And so they're looking at, the home is, not a haven. It affects the world, it's affected by the world, and here are these intersecting wider circles of how we all affect each other. And they have been home economists have been very worried about the climate crisis and about ecology since then. And it's a big part of classes today. So for instance, I talk about this example a lot because I think it's so brilliant. A teacher named Angela DeHart, who was teaching in that Virginia middle school, she taught sewing. She taught how to sew on a button, for instance, how to do hand sewing. And one of the things she also taught was the life cycle of a cotton t-shirt. And she looked at the ecological damage that the fashion industry causes, which is enormous, and the labor problems, which are enormous. And students learned all about that. And then, guess what? You care about mending your clothes when you know what's behind them. And I went to the American Association of Family and Consumer Sciences conference in 2018, and there were all these fashion projects that involved waste from factories, zero waste processing, it's the projects that students do in these classes are very concerned with ecology. And I just, it's at its best, even at less than best, home economics is project-based learning, and it has this power to look at both the micro of individual actions and the macro of global change. And one of the things that I've been talking, they sewed a gajillion masks, home ec students did in the last year. And they've been talking about public health and sanitation. I mean, even it's ventilation, right? When I started, home economists were super into ventilation. This was like a big health thing of the 19th century. And I was reading this, I was like, who the hell cares about that? Well, and here we are.
Well, so home economics is everything.
It is everything.
Not just cookies. So if anyone has any questions, you can come up to these mics on either side. And so that's where you can ask. We don't do them just for safety. And if not, I can keep going. I have tons of questions endlessly.
I can't believe that none of you guys has questions.
Okay.
Great.
Thank you. This is fascinating, and I think it sort of shows how everything relates to everything else.
Yes.
I was wondering, based upon the research you've done, if you could sort of comment on the wellness industry, which is so profound today, and how that relates to your research, and just some thoughts you might have on that.
Yeah. That is a great question. So you're talking about the Kardashians and what they do to their bodies. Whom amongst us could even start to think? I think that, one of the things that there's a lot of things that bother me about the wellness industry, not least of which is like quack science or quack pseudoscience. What strikes me home economists were into health. The very first book, 1841, Catherine Beecher, who was the first person to call this to use the name domestic economy, to say that this was not some natural pursuit, that it should be taught in a school. She had all of these calisthenics and all of these, like, I mean, she was also one of the birthplaces of phys ed. So there's certainly a lot in home economics about today, about, you know, nutrition and good eating and getting some exercise. But they're not so big on quackery or like obsession, which I think is good. And I mean, one of the things that's so refreshing is I read just, you know, I have 2,000 plus entries in my like bibliography software. I read unbelievable numbers of pages written by the home ec profession. And it's not about, like, it's so good to see all of this. It's all about women, but none of it is about our bodies or what we look like. It's about what we do and how we change the world and make it a better place. And I think, and this is, you know, sort of, you know, Danielle editorializing here, which as a journalist I don't do a ton of, like, I think it's such a freaking waste of time and waste of energy and waste of money for us to get so obsessed about, like, yes, you need to be healthy. Yes, it's important to be healthy, but like, so much of this stuff of like this optimal wellness above just, you know, I can get up today and do what I have to do is a waste of time and energy. And there's so much more to work on in the world.
And you get in that in the book too, about like the juxtaposition of thinness. Like there was a moment where they're like, let's get everyone skinny, and then the home economists were like, no, let's get everybody healthy.
Right.
And there was this like question there. Also, could you talk just for a second about alcohol?
Oh yeah. Oh.
Because alcohol was talked about in the book. A lot of home economist practices were to get men away from drinking so that they wouldn't destroy everything, which is like the history of America, right?
So the home economics was very tied in with the what's the word I'm looking for?
Temperance.
Temperance. Thank you. With the temperance movement. So Margaret Murray Washington's Tuskegee Women's Club which did an extraordinary range of community improvement, social work, community education activities. They had a subcommittee on temperance, and they had a subcommittee on suffrage, and they had a subcommittee on taking over the local Black Youth Reformatory and making it a healthy and you know, helpful place, and on, you know, home economics education. But there were a lot of home economists who were into temperance, which could and often did coexist with some really unpleasant classist, racist views. So part of, yes, what they wanted was some home economists thought that if you fed men a satisfying diet, if you fed poor men, then they wouldn't drink and beat their wives. And I mean, I think we all agree it's important to, you know, eliminate domestic violence, but this idea that like alcoholism is caused by not having a nice enough dinner, I mean, that's A, ridiculous, B, puts even more like shame and work on the wife here, who's being now blamed for apparently not feeding her husband a good enough diet. Also, I mean, the Deweys, who were Melville Dewey of the library codification system, who he and his wife hosted the Lake Placid Conference on Home Economics starting in 1899, which was the foundational codifying conference for 10 years of the field. They had their resort in Lake Placid was no smoking, no drinking. Any woman caught smoking would be kicked out. It was also all white. It was all no Jews, no African Americans. And you know, when I looked at, geez, so the dozen people who came to the first Lake Placid conference, they were all white. Yeah, that wasn't a coincidence. That was because the Dewey said, there will be no alcohol here, and also there will be no black people. So it was, you know, connected very deeply with the temperance movement. And, you know, after that, the temperance movement, as we all know, succeeded and then failed and fizzled out. And you don't see anything about that later on, except to talk about alcohol abuse much later on, in the way that we talk about it now.
Amazing. I don't know could someone tell me the time? And also,
what we got here. Yeah, who's our timekeeper?
She's our timekeeper. How much time do we have left?
Just like about 2 minutes. Okay, 2 minutes.
So in conclusion, I just wanted, so I was going to just say, so Danielle has like suggestions. I'm just going to read a little bit from her conclusion. She says, home economics is, can, and should be an interdisciplinary ecological field that explores the connections between our homes and the world with an eye to addressing the root causes of problems such as hunger, homelessness, isolation, and environmental devastation.
Yes.
We don't need to teach every kid to use a sewing machine, she says. And we especially don't need to quiz teenagers on naming a sewing machine's parts, as I heard one teacher in training plan. Instead, we should teach how the technology of the sewing machine changed the world. Students should learn about the labor problems of Southeast Asian sweatshops and the urban gig economy, the beauty and significance of the quilts made by formerly enslaved African Americans, the electrical engineering behind e-textiles, ways to limit the pollution caused by fabric dyes and create non-toxic alternatives. She wants everyone to lead sophisticated instructions. Yeah. She wants home economics not to die, but to be revived, and for us to learn the history of women.
Yeah.
And
so you guys you can all go do that, right?
Yeah.
Right? Cool. Yep.
Thank you so much. This is amazing.
Thank you.